In November 1982, New Zealand's Southern Alps looked particularly stunning. The majestic Aoraki, the sacred Maori mountain, towered over the island like an ice guardian. At an altitude of more than 3 kilometers, where temperatures could plummet to minus 50 degrees Celsius, it made its own laws. Here in the realm of eternal ice and piercing wind, even experienced climbers speak in whispers, knowing that one wrong decision can cost lives. This mountain does not forgive mistakes. Its steep slopes and massive glaciers hold many secrets, and sudden storms can turn an ordinary climb into a battle for survival. Professional rescuers know that when Aoraki shows its true colors, the chances of rescue melt away with the last rays of the sun. The story we tell today will change your perception of the limits of human possibility and what it means to truly fight for life. It is the story of how, in an instant, the rescuers themselves became those in desperate need of help. November 1982. New Zealand's South Island. Aoraki National Park is set amidst the majestic Southern Alps, home to the country's highest mountain, Aoraki, also known as Mount Cook. Its peak reaches 3,724 meters above sea level, and its slopes are covered with massive glaciers and deep crevasses. At this time of year, the weather in the park is particularly unpredictable. Strong winds from the Tasman Sea can bring a storm in a matter of hours, turning clear skies into snowy chaos. Temperatures at the summit often drop below minus 20 degrees Celsius, and wind gusts can reach hurricane force. The mountain's eastern ridge, one of the most technically challenging climbing routes, is known for its steepness and exposure. There are no shelters from the weather. These mountains do not forgive mistakes. Rapid weather changes, avalanche danger, and difficult terrain make Aoraki one of the most dangerous peaks in the Southern Hemisphere. Even experienced climbers treat it with special respect, carefully choosing the time to climb it. The National Park's search and rescue team had a new addition to its team of experienced climbers, Phil Dool. Tall and silent, he was a contrast to his new colleague, 23-year-old Mark Inglis. Mark, who had been passionate about the mountain since childhood, had by this time worked for the park's rescue service for several years, where he had worked his way up from novice climber to professional rescuer. In their work, mutual understanding between partners often became a matter of life and death. Rescuers had to land from helicopters on steep slopes, rappel down sheer cliffs, and work in extreme weather conditions. That's why Mark suggested to Phil that they climb Aoraki together. They needed to test how cohesively they could operate in the mountains. The eastern ridge of the mountain was ideal for such a test, a technically challenging but passable route for experienced climbers. On November 15th, Mark and Phil carefully checked the weather forecast. According to the Weather Service, the impending storm was not expected to reach the mountain area for at least 24 hours. This was enough time, they calculated, for a quick ascent and descent. Speed-oriented, they chose a minimalist approach to gear. Their backpacks contained no sleeping bags, no tent, no radio, and no cooking burner. Of food, they took only a light dry ration, a bag of drink concentrate, and a couple cans of canned food. Technical equipment included the essentials: crampons, ice axes, ropes, and carabiners for difficult sections. On their feet were plastic mountaineering boots with inner liners, standard gear for technical mountaineering. Their plan was to climb the east ridge to the middle peak of Aoraki. The route required a lot of experience, but with good weather conditions it was quite passable in one day. They took with them a map and compass for navigation. In the pre-dawn twilight of November 15th, Mark and Phil began their ascent up the eastern ridge of the Aoraki. The morning was clear, without a single cloud in the sky. At 3,700 meters, they had spectacular views of the surrounding peaks and the Great Plateau, an amphitheater of glaciers and rocks considered the center of New Zealand mountaineering. By mid-afternoon, their progress had slowed due to difficult ice conditions. As the ice axes struck, the ice began to split and peel off in round plates, making the climb extremely unreliable and dangerous. Soon, the climbers noticed the first signs of changing weather. the temperature began to drop, and dark clouds appeared over the summit. The roar of the wind on the upper parts of the route became louder and louder. The storm, which according to the forecast was to arrive only in 24 hours, was rapidly approaching the mountain. As the storm hit Mount Aoraki, visibility dropped to near zero. Mark and Phil found themselves at the epicenter of the fierce storm, at an altitude of more than 3,300 meters. The icy winds were blowing through and temperatures were rapidly dropping well below freezing. With zero visibility and bitter cold, the climbers realized that they were in mortal danger. An attempt to descend in such conditions was tantamount to suicide. The steep slopes of the eastern ridge, covered with ice and snow, turned into an impregnable wall in stormy conditions. The only chance for survival was to seek shelter. Advancing along the ridge and battling the hurricane-force winds, they spotted a small opening in the ice wall, the entrance to a natural cave. This tiny shelter, later named the Middle Peak Hotel, was a cavity in the ice measuring about 4 by 5 feet. The cave could barely hold 2 people, but even this cramped space seemed like an escape compared to the raging elements outside. Once the climbers were inside, the roar of the wind grew quieter, and its murderous force no longer tormented their bodies. But they realized that this shelter could be their salvation as well as their death. The struggle for survival in the first days became a real challenge. The cave, despite its tiny size, protected from the killer wind, but not from the cold. The temperature inside stayed well below freezing. In this cramped space, the climbers could only sit or lie huddled together. Every movement was difficult. Their frozen clothes stiffened their bodies, and any contact with the icy walls threatened to cause further heat loss. Their food supplies were critically low. A few biscuits, a bag of drink concentrate, and a can of canned peaches. Mark and Phil immediately began strictly rationing the provisions, realizing that help might not come soon enough. Thirst was a separate problem. They could not eat snow or ice, as this would only exacerbate hypothermia. At such an altitude, dehydration progressed especially fast. Every exhalation took precious moisture out of the body, and there was nothing to replenish it. By the end of the second day, the first signs of frostbite appeared. The socks and inner liners of the boots, soaked during the ascent, had turned to ice, creating ideal conditions for tissue damage. The plastic boots, perfect for technical mountaineering, were now a source of torment. Feet began to lose sensitivity, and a characteristic numbness appeared, the first sign of serious frostbite. As experienced climbers, they realized that this was the beginning of irreversible changes in the tissues. In an attempt to keep at least some warmth, the climbers were forced to stay in close contact, sharing body heat. Every movement had to be calculated. Unnecessary activity led to increased sweating, which in extreme cold could be fatal. At an altitude of more than 3,000 meters, the body was working at the limit of its capabilities, trying to compensate for the lack of oxygen and resist the cold. Nights were becoming a real challenge. The temperature dropped even lower, and the lack of movement increased the feeling of cold. They tried to support each other with conversation, fighting sleep, which in hypothermia could be fatal. Each hour turned into infinity, and the hope of better weather melted away along with their strength. By the end of the first week, the situation had become critical. Their food supplies were running low. They were stretching the last crumbs of biscuit over several meals, trying to cheat hunger. The drink concentrate had long since run out, and thirst was becoming more and more excruciating. They tried moistening their lips with snow, but it brought only temporary relief, increasing the hypothermia. The cave, measuring only 4 by 5 feet and a little more than a man's height, kept the temperature around -20 degrees Celsius. The smooth, icy walls reflected the slightest sound, creating a rumbling echo. The only way out, a small entrance hole, was now partially covered in snow, which helped keep the relative warmth inside. The frostbite progressed inexorably. Now the entire forefoot of both climbers was frozen, and the skin had taken on a characteristic bluish hue. The swelling caused by the accumulation of frozen blood in the tissues made any movement of the feet excruciating. They understood what was happening. First, the blood vessels constricted in an attempt to retain body heat. Then ice crystals formed in the tissues, destroying the cells. After that, the irreversible process of tissue die-off begins. Mark, with his medical background as a paramedic, could follow the progression of their condition in detail. He realized that at this level of frostbite, loss of limbs was inevitable. The tissues had already turned black, indicating the beginning of necrosis. They had made the hard but only right decision to sacrifice their legs for survival. Any attempt to warm their legs would have meant unbuttoning their clothes, which would have resulted in the loss of precious body heat and the risk of general hypothermia. In the cramped space of the cave, where every touch of the icy walls threatened to bring on new frostbite, the temperature periodically dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. It became especially cold at night, when the outside temperature dropped even lower. Condensation from breathing froze on the walls in a thin crust of ice, making the surfaces even more slippery. Each day brought new problems. Constant contact with the ice caused Mark to develop a serious lung infection. His breathing became heavy and hoarse, each breath accompanied by pain. His kidneys began to fail due to the critical slowing of blood circulation, which manifested itself in decreased urination and swelling. The body was going into energy conservation mode, shutting down non-essential functions for the sake of keeping vital organs running. Their only hope remained improved weather and the arrival of rescuers. Without outside help, their chances of survival were diminishing by the hour. On the seventh day of confinement, the first glimmer of hope appeared. The wind died down a little, and through the shroud of snow they heard the sound of a helicopter approaching. With the weather still stormy, the helicopter could not hover for evacuation, but as it flew past the cave, the crew spotted Phil's face in the opening. The rescuers attempted to drop an emergency kit. The first attempt was unsuccessful. The bag of supplies was picked up by the wind and flew over the ridge. On the second approach, Phil managed to catch the second kit. Inside were sleeping bags, warm clothes, a gas burner, canned Irish stew, energy drinks, chocolate, and 2 radios. Despite the long-awaited supplies, the climber's condition continued to deteriorate. By the 10th day, Mark was increasingly delirious. He thought he could see city lights and warm houses. At such times, he would try to get out of the cave, confident that he could just walk barefoot to a warm shelter. Phil, despite his own dire condition, had to physically restrain his partner. Establishing radio contact brought hope, but also a hard realization. For the first time in a week, they could communicate with the search and rescue team. Mark's conversation with his wife, Anna, revealed the bitter truth. A lot of people had risked their lives to save them. By this point, one rescue helicopter had already crashed at the top of the Empress Glacier, miraculously with no casualties. The next 5 days became an agonizing wait. Hypothermia significantly slowed down all thought processes. Even simple conversations over the radio required serious effort. Professional knowledge of rescue operations was now turning against them. They knew exactly what was happening to their bodies. Slowing heart rates, internal organ dysfunction, progressive frostbite. These were all signs of the approaching end. Each radio communication session brought hope of a speedy rescue, but time after time the weather made evacuation impossible. The morning of November 28, 1982, brought a long-awaited improvement in the weather. 13 days after the start of their ordeal, the wind had finally died down enough to make a rescue possible. Half an hour after dawn, a pilot's voice came over the airwaves as the rescue helicopter, the Schwirl, piloted by Ron, an experienced pilot, approached the cave. In the helicopter was Don Berge, New Zealand's most experienced rescuer. When his figure appeared in the cave opening, the complex evacuation operation began. Over 13 days, the entrance hole had been partially covered with ice and snow. Don Berge and his team spent about an hour carefully widening the opening with climbing ice axes. The work required extreme caution. Any wrong move could cause the cave's vault to collapse. Mark, who was in critical condition, was first in line. The The rescuers carefully moved him into a Bowman Bear stretcher, a special rescue equipment for evacuating mountain victims. The stretcher was equipped with a sturdy safety harness to protect the patient from accidental impacts during the lift. It took about 40 minutes to extract Mark from the cave. Any sudden movement could have aggravated his condition, especially given his severely frostbitten feet. The squirrel was balancing dangerously close to the cliff, fighting the gusts of wind. The weather, though it had improved, was still unstable. The temperature was well below freezing and visibility was limited. The winch slowly lifted the stretcher while the rescuers controlled its position, preventing it from hitting the rocks. After Mark's successful lift, Phil's evacuation began, which, due to his better physical condition, was quicker. The transition from the icy cold of the cave to the relative warmth of the helicopter was a shock to the exhausted climbers. The smell of aviation kerosene, engine oil, and the presence of other people seemed almost unreal after 13 days of isolation. The rescue operation, which required maximum concentration and skill from the entire team, ended successfully. The helicopter headed for the nearest hospital, where Mark and Phil were already waiting for the medical team. The next hours after the rescue became critical for the climbers' lives. They were met at the hospital by a team of doctors specializing in the treatment of frostbite and hypothermia. Initial examination revealed the severity of their injuries. Both climbers were diagnosed with deep frostbite on their lower limbs. Mark was additionally diagnosed with severe pneumonia and signs of kidney failure. The doctors left the climbers with no illusions. It was impossible to save their legs. The tissues turned black and began to die off. Gangrene was developing. The operation was scheduled for Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1982. For Mark, these weeks of waiting were filled with heavy thoughts. He realized that after waking up on Christmas Eve, his life would change forever. Support came from an unexpected direction. Fellow climbers visited him in the hospital, but not to express sympathy. They sneaked whiskey and on New Year's Day even organized an escape, took Mark in a wheelchair for a walk around the city with a stop at a bar. Their tough humor and refusal to pity became just the support he needed. After both legs were amputated below the knee, a long road of rehabilitation began. But even during this period, Mark never gave up the thought of returning to the mountains. The rescue story on Mount Aoraki was a turning point in the lives of both climbers, but it did not break their spirit. After a long rehabilitation and adaptation to their prosthetic limbs, Mark and Phil returned to an active life. Their recovery was an example of incredible willpower and commitment to life. In 2000, Mark Inglis achieved a remarkable success. He won a silver medal in cycling at the Sydney Paralympic Games, becoming the first New Zealand cycling medalist in Paralympic history. But even this triumph was not the limit of his potential. Immediately after winning the medal, he made a new decision: to return to Mount Aoraki. After 2 attempts, Mark successfully climbed the peak that once nearly cost him his life. This ascent was not just a personal victory, but also proof that physical limitations are no barrier to a strong spirit. However, even this was not the end point of his achievements. In 2006, 24 years after the tragedy in the ice cave, Mark Inglis accomplished what seemed impossible. He became the first person in history with a double leg amputation to conquer Everest. His ascent of the world's highest peak has become a symbol of the indomitable will to live and the will to overcome any obstacle. The story of Mark Inglis and Phil Dula is not just a story of survival in extreme conditions. It is a testament to the human spirit's ability to not only endure the unthinkable, but to turn tragedy into triumph. Their journey from rescuers in need of rescue to conquerors of the world's highest peaks shows that there are no obstacles that cannot be overcome by willpower and the pursuit of life. Tell us, what would you have done in their place in that ice cave? What decisions do you think were key to their survival? Perhaps you have triumphs of your own. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you liked this story, support the video with a like. It will help more people learn about this unique example of human resilience. Subscribe to the channel, because every survival story is not just a dramatic story, but a lesson about what a person can do in a critical situation. See you in the next episodes.